So, why a symposium on Chinese investment? The idea came last year for when I was at the conference in Amsterdam for the European Conference of the European Studies, and one of the last panel coordinated by Sophie Meunier and others was about Chinese investment in Europe, and I thought that that's a very interesting topic. I went to this panel and I was the only one participant. The rest was only the speakers. And there I learned that there will be a special issue on the question. Now it's published. We can send the reference if you are interested. But I found the paper really interesting, and the question posed very important because it's rather new, that we have investment from China, at least continental China, in Europe, and we know very little, I think, about the dynamic. And then I asked Jan, who is in charge, among other things, at the Institute to deal with the question of multinational, to organize the symposium, and we had the pleasure to see that more people are working than we thought about that topic, and we decided to organize not what we organize normally, a monthly forum, which is 1 or 2 speakers, 1.5 hour, but to have a kind of symposium. I found that symposium that's look nice. It's, I don't know exactly the definition of a symposium. Someone asked me today why a symposium. I say, okay, that's just nice word. I think that fit well. And to have 2 sessions, to have a little bit more time for presenting and also having questions from your side. So we divide that in 2, and also ask Jan to put the scene in the first in kind of introduction of the session. So I give you directly the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to provide some background to the presentations today by showing you some data on Chinese investment in Europe. And recently, a number of acquisitions by Chinese investors have attracted headlines in Europe, and I would like to start with some of these headlines, also because it allows me to show some pictures which people seem to like. The first headline is from the UK, where the Chinese investors have acquired, among others, household food brand Vitabix. They invested in the Hinkley Point power plant, and they took also a stake in the Heathrow Airport. They are also active in the North Sea oil. The second headline is in the pictures from Greece, where the Chinese shipping group COSCO now controls 2 of the 3 terminals at the Piraeus port, and more infrastructure deals are apparently in the pipeline in the country. Now, the increase in Chinese investment since 2010 has been indeed impressive. We observed something like a 340% increase since, between 2010 and 2012. However, as this figure also shows, the actual stock of FDI, of Chinese FDI in Europe, is still very small. In 2012, it was only 0.7% of the FDI stock that comes outside of Europe in Europe. Now, these figures don't include Chinese investment routed through Hong Kong. A number of Chinese investors indeed do sort of come through Hong Kong. So this table, which is less easy to interpret, but that does include the figures with Hong Kong. And what it shows is that if we include also investment routed through Hong Kong, we get a higher share of FDI stock in Europe. In 2012, it would be like 2% of extra EU27 FDI stock coming from China, mainland China plus Hong Kong. And we also, if we add together Hong Kong and China, we see that this increase in 2010, between 2010 and 2012, wasn't that impressive in a way. So there's more continuity. And the last thing that I wanted to do with this table is to compare the importance of Chinese investment with investment from other countries in the world. So here we have top 10 sort of countries from which investment into Europe originates, and if we combine China and Hong Kong, we get a figure in terms of FDI stock which is comparable to that of Russian investment in Europe. It will be less than the FDI stock from Brazil, or Canada, or Japan, or Switzerland, or the US. Here are some data on mergers and acquisitions that shows that Germany and the UK are particularly important targets of Chinese investment. Third one is the Netherlands, but I would suspect that this is in a way an artifact, because many companies choose to base their activities in Europe and the Netherlands for tax and investment protection reasons. The same data also allows on mergers and acquisitions, allows breakdown in terms of sectors. We see that the industrial, consumer, and energy sectors are most important targets of Chinese acquisitions, and this data includes also Hong Kong. The final slide I want to show you, or the final figures I want to show you, is different data on investment. It's a more broader definition of investment, including also greenfield and also large contracts. And it doesn't include Hong Kong. What it confirms is the importance of Britain, Germany, and France. These are one of the largest of targets. In the UK, the investment is very diversified, and the UK has seen also strong growth since 2012. In France, energy is particularly important, but also there's sort of involvement in consumer and food sectors. In Germany, we see also diversified involvement, but a lot of investment going into machinery, alternative energy, car parts and equipment. In 2011, actually, in Germany, China surpassed the US as the largest investor in the country from outside of the EU, if measured by new inflows. Now, this figure also features, or this graph features also Italy, Portugal, and Greece, where the Chinese investors have been active since 2011 only, but in a way the involvement has been much more spectacular. These countries have seen a large growth in FDI from China, investment from China since 2011, in the context of other investors in a way avoiding those countries. The implication being that if you look at the privatization program that the Portuguese government launched in 2011, 45% of receipts in this program would come from Chinese investors. This would be mainly infrastructure, privatization, and finance as well. Italy was the biggest target of Chinese investment in 2014. The importance of Chinese investor, or the apparent importance of Chinese investment is such that often we in Italy read them being discussed as here, the Chinese investors being discussed as sort of second Marshall Plan. There's a number of sort of high-profile deals, such as Huawei opening a research and development center in Milan, which is to employ 1,700 scientists. Well, finally, Greece. There we see still quite modest figures, particularly infrastructure. We saw the picture of the port, but a number of other deals are being negotiated at this point. This includes deals in just airports, operating airports, but also tourism. So, for instance, you may remember the story of the site of Greek Olympics not being used after that. Eventually, or finally, at this point, it seems like it's Chinese and Gulf State Consortium going to develop this site. Now, why this should be a concern for labour? We have a number of sort of observations from the investor community that the culture gap, and in particular the problem with handling human resources, is seen by major issue when it comes for the Chinese companies operating in Europe. Survey by the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China that interviewed Chinese investors who are active in Europe has shown that the investors or the companies would quote labor laws, human resource costs, immigration rules, and cultural differences in management styles the biggest obstacles to operate in the continent. And we have also some anecdotal evidence of sort of a big involvement that seemed to be quite problematic, like the Kovac deal in Poland, which was a big contract for a Chinese company to build a motorway from Warsaw to the German border. And this road deal collapsed in the context of repeated breaches of the labour law, problems with complying with Polish environmental legislation. And for that reason, in these sort of question marks about the cultural gap or the issues with compliance to labour regulation, we have invited 4 speakers to expand on those issues, and we hope that by the end of today's symposium we'll know better.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for the invitation to talk. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Graham Hollinshead, and I work at the University of Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom. There are 3 main areas in my presentation. The first is to reflect on the nature of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment, and that's not been looked at very much really in the literature. There's been quite a bit on foreign direct investment going into China, but there's not been an awful lot of research on the specific nature of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment into other countries. So I'm just going to make a few observations on that. The context for the national context for my research is Serbia. So I'm going to look at the relationship between Serbia and China, which has been going on for a long time, but that's been stepped up a gear in the last few years. And now there's a formal bilateral agreement between the Chinese government and the Serbian government about a number of projects, but particularly about infrastructure development projects. So I'm going to look at the nature of the Sino-Serbian strategic partnership and the major elements of that, which has very significant geopolitical consequences within Europe if Serbia is going to be a member state of Europe eventually. And then the third part of my presentation is to look at one specific project, which is a construction project, a bridge, the construction of a bridge by the China Road and Bridge Corporation over the River Danube near Belgrade. And previously the Chinese construction projects have been in developing countries, again based on bilateral governmental arrangements, often in Africa. This is quite a unique development because it's an infrastructural developmental project on the fringes of Europe. So I want to say something about this project, the employment issues relating to this project, but also the kind of geopolitical implications, as it potentially offers an avenue for Chinese investors to use leverage within the European Union, and there are geopolitical implications of this development. So just a few points to start off with on an overview of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment. As I just mentioned in the introduction, China's status as a foreign direct investor has really been subject to neglect in the literature. There's not an awful lot of work on the nature of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment, which is quite a glaring omission given that the volume of investment coming from China has increased quite dramatically over the last few years. We should say as well that the going overseas policy from China has been going on for a long time. It's been an element of modernization and the opening of the Chinese economy. So it's been going on, the Chinese state has been encouraging overseas foreign direct investment since the late 1990s. So China, it's an important issue because China is now the 3rd largest global foreign direct investor in the world after the USA and Japan. If we look at where's that investment is going, the bulk of it is still relatively regional within Asia, but as I mentioned before, it's gone predominantly to developing economies, but now is being directed to the fringes of Europe in terms of these infrastructure projects. So still only 6% of total outward stock is directed towards Europe, from China in 2011. One thing we'd have to say about Chinese overseas investment is it doesn't really resemble familiar foreign direct investment patterns. It seems to be the case with the emerging economies, that would be Brazil, Russia, India and China. There's a new form of overseas direct investment which is orchestrated and determined to a considerable extent by the state. So there's a debate about whether there's an emergence of state capitalism in these economies in relation to overseas investment. So I think that the role of the state in this investment and the role of state-owned companies is vital in understanding the nature of Chinese overseas direct investment. And actually it doesn't always look like overseas direct investment from a Western perspective, because it's quite often framed as aid and is organised through bilateral governmental arrangements. Something else we should say about Chinese investment is that those companies have significant advantages. The Chinese state-owned companies and in particular, because they can benefit from so-called imperfections in the Chinese capital market. So that those investments are supported financially by the state, which gives those companies advantages when they operate in overseas localities. Also, those companies can gain loans from Chinese banks, which are quite often on a preferential basis. There may be inefficiencies in the Chinese banking system. Putting it crudely, there might be some corruption. But those loans are available to these outward investment companies, which give them very significant economic power in relation to investors from other countries. I think the other thing we can note about the nature of Chinese investment, and I've read that this relates right back to Tiananmen Square, where China was condemned by Western powers, is that, again from our perspective, such investment has an idiosyncratic form. It tends to go, it's frequently gone to countries which are risky, where there are volatile institutional arrangements, and China has been prepared to tolerate those risks. And that probably relates back to the second point I've made there, which is the availability of capital by the government, so it's kind of underwrite those risks. So there is this orientation to invest in relatively volatile areas of the world where institutional arrangements are not so secure. And I suppose that another issue there is that China itself has operated in that environment. So it's very aware of the issues associated with operating within risky, institutionally volatile situations. It understands those issues in the southern part of Europe, or perhaps in Africa or whatever. So what are, if we're trying to read in the sort of, if it's organised by state, then it's not just going to be about economic motivations. There's also going to be state-led motivations underlying this investment and geopolitical influences. And as I said before, this form of investment has been orchestrated by the state over quite long periods. So just to give some idea of the philosophy, the political and economic philosophy underlying such investment, it's been evident that an invisible hand lies behind this investment, which is the role of government. It isn't just related to the autonomous actions of the corporations. They are being steered by government. And there's been a gradual process of operating overseas. The strategy can be understood as crossing the river by feeling the stepping stones. So a gradual process of moving out of China. It's been clear that although much of this investment has been framed as aid and development, that national self-interest for China has lay behind Chinese overseas foreign direct investment. In particular, the need to access foreign markets and a stable supply of resources, and particularly energy resources, which we would see in the investments in Africa in particular. there has been a pattern which is in a number of, there's an evolutionary set of developments I think we can observe around this investment, but since the 1990s. But in the earliest phase of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment, a major emphasis was placed on infrastructure development projects in developing countries, notably Africa. And one feature of this is that bridges, roads and so on were not built using indigenous labour. They were used by transporting peripatetic Chinese labour who lived in dormitories or whatever around these bridges in Africa or wherever. As mentioned before, these weren't really autonomous actions by corporations. They were orchestrated by governments, and they were predicated on bilateral government arrangements, frequently being framed as aid. Or as I mentioned, the self-interest of the Chinese political regime and economy was a vital consideration in driving these investments. Just to give some idea of the kind of geopolitical aspects, as a kind of quid pro quo for receiving the Chinese investment, Africa had to follow the Chinese line on certain territorial issues. And one was supporting the One China policy and not supporting the independence of Taiwan. So that was a very significant geopolitical quid pro quo that resulted from the receipt of aid by Africa. So what we've seen now is a kind of extended but China is tending to be very pragmatic in the way it regards governments. So it may not be helpful from Serbia's point of view to get this form of legitimacy and assistance in the longer term. And also, as I mentioned before, there are geopolitical issues in terms of the population at large who are maybe disposed to look more favourably towards assistance from China as well as Russia than EU assistance or broader Western assistance. So it has that implication. So just in conclusion, what can we make of this? And it's hard to discern. There are obviously many geopolitical benefits associated with this from the Chinese perspective. Is there a grand scheme? And that remains relatively unclear. However, given that the investments in China are at different levels of the value chain, the infrastructure, engineering, small and medium-sized enterprises, energy, it's not inconceivable that clusters of Chinese enterprises will grow in the longer term in the southeastern parts of Europe. And so this bridge, and this is relatively hypothetical, the bridge, as well as helping Serbia, may ultimately help China if such clusters are to develop in that part of Europe. I wanted to, oh, here's a picture of the bridge itself, which is actually, that's the public relations, that's the kind of symbolic rainbow representation of the bridge. So that's really it. I want to give you some references, but I haven't actually, because I've drawn out of other people's work, but I haven't got them to hand. So maybe I can add them a bit later on in the afternoon, because I really would like to credit people whose work I've drawn on, but I haven't actually mentioned them in the publication. So I'll try and get hold of them before the end of the afternoon and add them to the presentation. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you for the first presentation. I think having put this kind of key question, why China is investing in Europe, at least in some region of Europe, perhaps it's rather different for the investment already in Germany. And now we move to the second presentation and the discussion we would like to have, what are the consequences for the workers. So Damian was part of the project I mentioned when I was alone in the room.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. I will try without the microphone, but let me know in the back if I need to use it. Can you hear me well? Yeah, I'll speak loud enough, I hope. No? Okay. So I'm Damian Raess, I'm a political scientist working at the University of Geneva, and I would like to start by thanking Philippe for the invitation and also Jan for setting up this symposium. I'm also not quite sure what a symposium is about, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to present my work here. China, as a rising economic giant, has been on the radar screen of European decision makers for some time now. In 1978, China inaugurated its open policy, and in the next 10 to 15 years, it opened up the entire economy to foreign investment, turning China into the sweatshop of the world that we know. Now, this made in China that we know so well, from there, the global world economy is now turning into a new phase which is owned by China. Indeed, encouraged by the government, the Chinese companies are increasingly encouraged to acquire real assets throughout the world in order to access technology, brands, managerial know-how, and also the presence and direct contacts with local customers. It's been said, I think, in the two previous presentations that Chinese investment in Europe is growing quickly, in some countries actually exponentially, and this trend is likely to continue and to intensify, we believe, in the near future. But we have to keep in mind that the overall quantities remain small to this day. It's been said, but I think we should really stress that in 2012, less than 1% of total extra European inward foreign direct investment stock was coming from China. This is really a small portion, small pockets. Now, I also would like to say that researchers face a number of challenges and difficulties when trying to study Chinese investment and particularly their impact, social, cultural, and political. Some challenges stem from data constraints. For example, Eurostat, until very recently, only published aggregates FDI positions from Chinese investors, so at the national level, or at the industry sector level, but for the entire European Union. And so we didn't have, until very recently, data that were crossed by country and by sector. Again, because this is such a recent phenomenon and the quantities involved are small, it's also too early, I think, to draw sort of final and strong conclusions as to whether Chinese investment into Europe will end up being a positive sum or a zero-sum game. With these caveats in mind, I would like here to report some findings on an exploratory study that I conducted jointly with Brian Burgoon at the University of Amsterdam on the effects of Chinese FDI on European labor. Hosting Chinese investment is viewed simultaneously as with ambiguity and with trepidation. Chinese investment may provide great opportunities, but as well some threats, and arguably Chinese investment may represent stronger opportunities and stronger threats for Europe and for social Europe in particular than other investment sources. Among the opportunities, we can list the fact that the Chinese investor have deep pockets. That is, the amounts that they may be willing to invest are very substantial. And this in a European economy that is currently very depressed and that is in great need of investment and job creation. Opportunities also because China has a particular foreign policy tradition which respects the de jure sovereignty of host countries. And for example, unlike Europe and the US, that sort of when they deal with African countries, they put conditions on loans in terms of good governance, corruption, fighting corruption, etc. China does not have this sort of approach and does business with whomever is willing to do business with them. Translated to European labor market, that means that Chinese might be willing to respect host country standards and regulation as far as labor markets are concerned. With regard to new threats posed by Chinese investment, we can of course mention the fact that Chinese economy has a particular factor profile and the competitive position as a low-wage producer, and also the fact that it is a country that's pretty systematically flouts labor laws and standards in its own workshops, but also abroad. And there are cases in Greece, maybe also in Serbia, where we can see such violations taking place. I would like to address three questions with my presentation. First of all, does Chinese foreign direct investment flow more or less to regulated labor markets than do other investment sources? In other words, do Chinese investors reward lax regulatory labor market regimes within the European Union? Secondly, what are the strategies of organized labor representatives in dealing with real or expected investment from China? And based on a small-scale qualitative analysis, we would like here to go to the perceptions of organized labor representatives with respect to incoming Chinese investment. And finally, we also would like to probe a little bit what might be workers' attitudes towards Chinese FDI and Chinese management of globalization. And thus, maybe to put it a little bit, or link it to Graham's picture, I think he provided a little bit the background of some of the motives of why Chinese companies come to Europe, and then he zoomed into a particular case study, so that I zoom out a little bit again and to try to provide in a very exploratory fashion some provisional, I think, answer to these questions. So first, regarding thus the pattern of Chinese versus world FDI into Europe, the question again here is, does Chinese FDI flow to places where labor protections are lowest or where they are the highest? And in particular, does Chinese FDI flow depart from the pattern of investment from, let's say, world investors? And again, there are two competing possibilities here. One is that Chinese investors might shy away from the most regulated labor market settings in Europe, such as Germany, for instance, and the Netherlands, maybe, because such settings clash with the industrial relations practices that they know at home and that they understand as managers. On the other hand, the opposite hypothesis would be that what drives Chinese investment has nothing to do with labor considerations, and as much of the literature on the determinants of FDI shows, for example, for the determinants of OECD investments, it's driven by market access consideration, technology acquisition, etc. So we did a little test of that with some data, and we compared thus how Chinese FDI and world FDI relate to measures of aggregate level labor protections across a sample of EU host countries. And we use two measures of labor protections that come from the data from Botero and Jankov. The first one, shown here in this figure 1, is a measure of protections of collective bargaining rights. It includes the legal protections of the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining, the right to conduct strikes, and also the extent to which workers are allowed to participate in the management of companies. We use FDI stock measures for 2008, and what you can see thus first on this left-hand panel is a weak negative relationship thus between the level of FDI stock in 2008 and the level of protections of collective bargaining rights across the host EU countries, meaning this negative relationship that there is a tendency, a slight tendency of Chinese investors to invest more in regimes that are more lax from, let's say, a regulatory labor market perspective. But what is even more important for us is what then, to contrast the pattern of world investors and how they target different European countries in terms of also the stringency of the labor market regulation. And we also see a somewhat negative relationship, even weaker. But what is important here is that there's no statistically significant difference between the Chinese pattern and the world FDI pattern. If we take the second measure of labor market protections, it's also from the same database, but it's protection this time not of collective bargaining, but of employment conditions. It covers issues such as whether the law allows alternative employment contracts, such as part-time, fixed-term contracts, and to what extent this is, these workers are less protected than the permanent workers. It includes also issues of protections of working time, leaves, and also employment protection regulations, so relating to dismissals, etc. The results here show that we have a somewhat stronger negative relation between Chinese FDI and employment protection across EU host nations than was the case for collective bargaining. You can see that the slope of the sort of regression line here is more negative than was for collective bargaining, and the relationship here is statistically significant. But again, when you contrast it also to the pattern of world investment, here too the slope is a little more negative than it was before, and again the contrast is not that strong. And more importantly, when we control for GDP per capita, which I think is important to do, the statistical significant relationship, negative relationship on the left-hand side panel disappears actually. So what we conclude here is that there is a whisper of evidence that Chinese FDI flows more to settings with weaker employment protection, the left-hand side panel here. But what really is more important for our purpose here is to say that there's no evidence that Chinese FDI flows to more deregulated labor market settings than does actually world FDI investments. Now, moving into the second question, and what are, if at all, the strategies of organized labors in dealing with real or expected Chinese inward FDI in Europe. We have conducted a handful of interviews in the Netherlands, in Germany, and France, and we focused on these countries on the one hand because they are countries with among the highest levels of incoming foreign direct investment, so it might be a salient issue in these countries, and also because these countries have among the most regulated labor market, and therefore Chinese investors might represent, some of the threats, again, if we follow the sort of deregulatory hypothesis. It was a handful of interviews that were not selected randomly. For half of them, we used existing channels in order to obtain some information. We did 3 interviews in Germany, 2 in France, and 1 in the Netherlands. We had expected that organized labor in the EU would be skeptical and worried about Chinese foreign direct investment, but it turned out that it was much less the case that we had initially actually thought. And first of all, we figured out that labor officials, and that's the trends I detail now, is sort of summing up the findings from all the perspectives of these union leaders at different levels, local union leaders, regional union leaders. What came out first is that they do not perceive Chinese investors differently than, let's say, American investors or South Korean investors or Chinese investors. We explicitly asked this question. They don't stigmatize or have particular views on the investors because of the country of origin. And you can see that, for example, also with the first quote I put here on the slide. So the country of origin of capital really does not appear to be decisive in the way they will deal with investors. However, they are using essentially 2 other lenses we figured out in terms of investors that come from abroad. The first one is they distinguish between short versus long-term investment. In other words, they distinguish between patient capitalist and impatient capitalist, or yet, in other words, between sort of financial investments versus productive investments. That's the first lens that they use to approach, I would say, foreign investor. The second one is that they really care, and maybe not so surprisingly as labor representatives, they really care about how these investors will comport in relation to the national labor legislation, and again, regardless of the origins of capital. So for example, one German local union leader was insisting that the yardstick to judge foreign investors was really whether they would comply with the Works Constitution Act, for instance. Now, some other reasons that were mentioned by a few labor representatives was also a general expression of confidence with this new challenge. Because someone said that, well, 30 years ago it was the challenge from liberal America, as American companies were coming over to Europe and investing heavily. On the other hand, there was also the challenge from Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, Socialist Soviet Union, and sort of they've been facing and leading up to these challenges and are sort of confident that, again, they have the necessary tools to address the new challenges. Some also mentioned that there was a learning curve for Chinese investors. There has been some fiascos, for example, in Germany in the early 2000s, plant shutdowns and stuff like that. But actually that the Chinese, as they stay on for longer, would learn the practices in Germany and France and would stick to those, and so they were again quite optimistic about that. To sum up this part of the research, we find thus some surprising endorsements of Chinese FDI by the organized labor representatives to whom we talked to. To address the third question, sort of workers' attitudes towards Chinese FDI or Chinese management of globalization, we used a different research design, which was sort of more large and statistical analysis, and we drew on a survey question that we found in the Eurobarometer survey of 2010, where opinions were probed onto this statement that you can see here. The EU and China, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The EU and China have the same interest when dealing with globalization. This question is not unambiguous, we do acknowledge, but we interpret this question as being about whether Chinese and European interests are aligned in dealing with globalization. And so agreement with this statement expresses support for China with respect to European interests on issues of globalization. And so we labeled this dependent variable, what we want to explain as pro-China globalization management. Our main interest was to see how individual socioeconomic characteristics of the respondents would shape attitudes towards China and globalization. And especially we're interested in characteristics of vulnerable workers to the extent that they are not that well off, the less educated workers, the less skilled workers, maybe the unemployed workers. This is really what was, let's say, our core variables of interest. We also had a question that allowed us to identify those workers that were unionized or that had sympathy for unions. So we're also interested to see whether, for example, pro-union members were either more supportive of China globalization than non-unionized workers. And we're also interested actually in a nationwide measure of labor market provision coming from the same database that I used before on employment protection. And to one extent also working in a more regulated setting is associated with less enthusiastic positions about China and globalization. For example, the Germans might be more skeptical about incoming German investments, Chinese investment, precisely because it may represent a particular threat. The main results I will show you using this figure. I think that sums up nicely again our core findings with respect to these individual characteristics of the respondents. We find that more economically vulnerable respondents, particularly in the EU 15, the old member states, tend to be more supportive of pro-China globalization. And this is to some extent surprising, because it's exactly the opposite of what the attitude of the vulnerable group would be towards general globalization. We know from trade theory that the less skilled, the less educated, the poor workers tend to believe that globalization is not good for them because they are losers, and so they would be negatively related to, let's say, support for globalization. And here we see precisely that this more vulnerable group is actually more in favor of Chinese globalization. So if you just look at the magnitude of this effect, for low-educated people is where we have the most consistent finding and the strongest effect. You see that the low-educated have a likelihood of being more pro-China, that is 4.4% higher than their more educated counterparts. Manual workers are also more supportive of pro-China globalization than the non-manual workers, and here the percentage is 3.4. And also, people having difficulties paying bills, which is a proxy for the poorer people, equally are more likely to be supportive of China globalization than, let's say, wealthier citizens or individuals. Finally, and interestingly, people who are sympathetic to the labor movements are also more likely to be supportive of China globalization. And I think that finding is in line with our earlier finding about the perceptions of trade unions that seem to be embracing Chinese investment. And we see here that the workers and the rank and files might actually be informed maybe by precisely these views that is prominent among the labor leaders. My concluding slide, thus, Chinese FDI and European labor, much ado about nothing. I think that our account does provide indeed a cautiously optimistic account of what Chinese FDI represents for workers and for worker representatives so far. And it might well be that this turns out to be for the better and a positive sum game thus, but of course it remains to be seen, and there are things in future developments that could stop that from happening. To wrap up the findings that lead us to this cautiously optimistic account, and I wouldn't say we have a resolutely optimistic account, but really a cautiously optimistic one. So two main findings: we don't see evidence that Chinese investors reward lax regulatory settings more than world investors, and also we find thus a surprising embrace of Chinese FDI, China's management of globalization by the weakest workers, the more vulnerable workers, and the organized labor. Again, I think we have to keep in mind that this is an early phase of a phenomenon, and it's too early to draw strong and final conclusions. And as Chinese investment into Europe continues to intensify, and as more and better data becomes available, I think we need more studies in order to have basically a more comprehensive picture of what is happening. And I certainly look forward to the intervention of my colleague here in the panel, Wolfgang Müller, in a while, to see whether his findings on developments within, I think, German companies that have been taken over by Chinese investors corroborate sort of the general findings that we seem to put forward. And I certainly look forward also to the general discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and certainly we will continue this discussion with the two next speakers after the coffee break. But for the moment, I would like to engage the first discussion with the two first presentations. So there is a mic somewhere. I will keep the mic for another one, which is there. And if you can present yourself and say to who you want to address the question. Thank you. I see at least 1, 2, 3, 4. You can start from the first row and then the mic will go. Okay, second.
Maria Jepsen, ETUI. I mean, with regard to the second presentation about the surprising embrace of Chinese FDI, I mean, my interpretation would be exactly the opposite. It would be just as disillusioned by the EU approach to globalization as they think, by their perception of what Chinese globalization is. So it's the perception of, Chinese globalization is bad, so EU is bad as well. So you could go the other way around, saying I'm just as disillusioned about the way the EU deals with this. So, as you said, it's not unambiguous, but I think that, I would not at all draw the same conclusions as you drew. And the question to ask then especially with regard to your interpretation of how Chinese FDI goes forward, can it bring a new kind of state capitalism to Europe? What's the pull that one out and say, how far can they actually get with this?
Yeah, there is. Okay, that's it. There's one person at every row. That's good.
Okay, Tom Jenkins from ETUI. First, Philippe, I wish I'd been at that seminar, because this certainly is a subject of great interest to the ETUI, and we just got a project agreed by the Commission on exactly this subject, and we might well be calling on some of you people to give us a hand. The first point on that is that, as you probably know, there is an ongoing negotiation between the EU and China on an investment treaty. And of course that is going to change the magnitude if and when this is reached. We're interested to know, we've been told, that treaty will have in it a sustainable development chapter, i.e. the implementation of ILO standards within China. I know that most of the presentations are the inward investment, but we of course want to look at it both ways. A couple of points. First, and it was interesting the presentation about really, even if some Chinese companies claim to be companies, in fact they're all working for the Chinese state one way or the other, and drawing their investment from the sovereign funds or whatever. And that impacts on a current discussion where China wants to have market economy status with the EU. They're saying that next year, in 2016, when that'll be 10 years after the WTO entry, they should automatically get this. Now we are fighting that, and as is most of European industry, by the way, because it is not transparent. It is not, and that's to do with dumping cases. And I wonder whether in your research anything has been said about whether Chinese companies or China investment is linked to this market economy status, or whether there is evidence that they do not meet the criteria. The other point, which I'm just throwing in this because, as you know, in the TTIP discussions, one of the great issues has been investor-state dispute settlement. Now we know that some of these ISDS cases, provisions do exist between some EU countries and China. One example being Belgium and China. There is a case currently, I think they're called Li Pang. They're an insurance, a Chinese insurance company, who are suing the Belgian state for having saved one of our banks here. I can't remember which one now, in 2008. But again, do you think that this ISDS issue will come up or does come up in these kinds of discussions? Because when we think trade nowadays, we think China. And I think that there is still an argument within us as whether you need ISDS even with China, even if you don't need it with the United States. I mean, I don't think we do. Thank you.
Michael Sonos, hello. I've got only a brief question on the character of the meeting, taking into account the growing relevance of China. It's of course always very interesting and important to talk about China, but experience shows that there is always added value, not only talking about each other, but also talking with each other. So I would be interested whether you had made any attempt to invite representatives of the Chinese side to this event, may it be from the business community, may it be from the Chinese mission to the EU, because they are available in Brussels.
I just wanted, Peter, Pawlicki, IG Metall, Frankfurt. I just wanted to ask Graham a very short question. You mentioned the workers, the Chinese workers on the bridge, and how valuable they are as expertise bearers and also as for this risk mitigation strategy. Does this translate into better living conditions? So, I mean, especially higher wages, or how does this company source these people?
Yeah, John Kira from Dutch website China Square with my colleague. I have two questions for Mr. Graham Hollinshead. Don't you agree that the final purpose of the Chinese investment in Serbia, of course there is historical reasons, but for the future, that it is the Chinese goods that will be going shipped to Piraeus port, that they finally would have a corridor to Serbia, to Budapest, for I think that the final purpose of this good relations between China and Serbia, that it is having goods shipped from Piraeus to the European market, and therefore Serbia and Budapest might be, let's say, an intermediary, or this bridge might be an intermediary measure. If this would be the case, then it might be that the harbor of Antwerp, Hamburg, and Rotterdam might get less goods in the future, and therefore my second question to the panel is: what is the legal position of the companies in the Piraeus port? Are there Chinese companies? Are there Greek people that are hired under the Greek law? Because, of course, from union point, it's important to know if they have to comply with the EU law, or have they falling under Chinese legal law? Because you mentioned in they're working 7 days, 24 hours, but as I know from African experience, they're working, of course, 12 hours a day, maybe, for some months, but after these months, they're going back for 3 months to China, for example. So my fundamental question is how it is working in the Piraeus port from legal point and from social union point of view.
Still two, at least.
Gerard, FGTB Belgium. In fact, the last speaker was maybe very optimistic because he deal with the direct effect of Chinese investment on European workers. I mean, he told us that the Chinese investors do behave on the same way than other international investors. But what about the indirect effect? Because I also heard that we face here a state capitalism. So it means that behind the private investment there are government interests. And through the private investment, the Chinese government can, for example, influence the position of the national governments and the position of the EU concerning the foreign policy of the EU and the position the EU takes in relation to the respect of social standards and human rights in China, with also consequences, maybe indirect consequences on the European workers. So my question is, if we already have today some concrete examples of China trying to influence the foreign policy of the EU concerning human rights and respect of social standards in China.
Okay, thank you, Bill, with ETUI. So first of all, thank you very much. Indeed, a very important issue. We shouldn't forget that China is becoming net capital exporter this year exactly. So the outflow of capital is first time it will exceed the inflow of FDI. So it's an important thing, and I think if we demonize it or not, this will be a factor to countries. I think it's certainly important, interesting to categorize different investment types, and certainly state-owned enterprises play the majority role, but I think the range is quite wide, and it is changing. So we shouldn't fall into a trap of putting China or Chinese investments into one box, because it's changing really fast. So I mean, there are clearly huge state conglomerates with clear geopolitical interests behind it. Then there are more state-owned enterprises with using state capital or capital provided by state-owned bank, but more having a more business-oriented strategy. And then there are genuine business motivated FDI projects, and there are also private companies, and private companies are emerging fast, like Alibaba. Yeah? Alibaba is shopping in Silicon Valley. And it is not the Chinese government's. So anyway, so it's first of all, the magnitude is important. It is dynamically increasing. Actually, in this year, the Chinese government was liberalizing outbound FDI. So there had been a regulatory change, and a further surge is to be expected. So well, I think whether we like it or not, it is there, and it is better to examine and analyze and be prepared.
Okay, so many questions, difficult questions. So I propose that if the two first speakers want to have the help of the two next speakers, don't hesitate to share their knowledge for some of the questions. We will return, I think, also to some of the questions in the second round. But first, I let you to answer a rather short answer, if possible.
Well, maybe I'll abuse the. Maybe me holding the mic. On the question of the state-owned companies, so the mergers and acquisition data showed actually shows that 80% of these deals were included state-owned companies, but in the share of private investors in 2011 to 2013 increased by 30%. So far has been very much state-owned, but we see an increase, a rapid increase in private companies.
Okay, brief answers to some of the questions. I don't think I can answer all of them. And I mentioned before that I was drawing on other people's work. I would like to thank the PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham, who's written quite a lot about the Sino-Serbian partnership. And I don't have his name later. So is there state capitalism moving into Europe? I would say it's a kind of indirect effect in that these corporations that were formerly state-owned are gaining the benefit of state support and have economic advantages on the basis of that. So I think that's the way it's being imported into Europe. There are as I mentioned before, there are institutional similarities between China and the countries that they're investing in. For example, Serbia. So it's possible, and Serbia the government is still highly influential in Serbia. So one of the issues may be that Serbia can learn from China in a broader sense in the transition, in transitioning, from a communist state to a capitalist state, and there could be that kind of transfer of knowledge based on the similarity in the institutional arrangements, which is being orchestrated at a governmental level. So I think in that more intangible way, there's an effect of state capitalism being influential in those parts of Europe. The working conditions on the bridge, as I mentioned, these were effectively tied workers. They went back home to China once a year for Chinese New Year. The levels of pay were relatively generous compared to Serbian conditions and certainly to Chinese conditions. But the other conditions were not beneficial in terms of the intensification of work and health and safety arrangements. It may be perceived as a kind of little China in Europe, because we heard that, for example, there's a Chinese cook there, and that they engage in activities such as basketball, and they can watch Chinese television and so on. So those softer factors are in place for those workers. But as I mentioned before, I think they come from particular regions of China. and the workers from those regions are disposed to work with this company in the various regions in which it's found. Very interesting point about Piraeus and the corridor. I've got a colleague. This was actually published in a journal called Work, Organisation, Labour and Globalisation, which is edited by Ursula Hughes at the University of Hertfordshire, and she's looked at Piraeus. But I was co-writing something with her, and we put a map of Europe, and there did seem to be a logic in terms of the strategy, the geographic strategy of Chinese investment, the corridor that you're referring to, that was connecting the ports via Serbia to the heartlands of Europe, in fact. And it's possible it's not just about Chinese investment moving into the southeast. Eventually, the longer-term strategy could be to move such investment into the kind of heartlands of Europe by learning about what in the periphery about how to operate in Europe in the more regulated environment. And in a sense, that movement of capital resembles earlier flows of people, of migrants, who moved into Serbia and then moved into other parts of Europe. So there seems to be some correlation there in terms of capital and human mobility across Europe. But there would be significant implications for other ports in the northern part of Europe if that's what's happening. I would certainly agree that we should involve Chinese commentators in this discussion. It's very important, and they would have another perspective on what they're doing, which is a much more benign perspective on the objectives behind the bridge and so on. So I think in future debates it's very important to involve Chinese unionists, politicians, policymakers, and so on for their perspective. So I've missed a few of those questions, but they're just a few observations.
I think quite a few questions addressed the role of the Chinese state in this international strategy of companies, so the issue of state capitalism, whether there's always the hidden hand of the Chinese government behind, let's say, takeovers done by Chinese groups in Europe. First of all, again, I think also Jan's data that was presented shows that the breadth of sectors that are affected by Chinese investment shows that this is a structural trend rather than that actually Chinese investors may be driven by states' interest or cherry-picking one or two strategic sectors where we could sort of interpret that as a more political or strategic action on the part of the government. So I think, yeah, the way I would interpret that there's still a commercial motivation and drive for all these FDIs, again, precisely because they are spread so widely on a lot of sectors. And actually here, some of the data I have here even, I think they seem to contradict maybe the pattern that Jan just mentioned with respect to what share of total FDIs is sort of state-owned companies as opposed to private-owned companies. I have here like some data from the Rhodium Group. I don't know, some of you may know that group. It's a consultancy, and they've produced reports on Chinese inward FDI in Europe and in the United States. And this is a 2012 report, and it's quite authoritative. They've been quoted by the Financial Times, for instance. And they have a particular methodology. They only limit themselves to deals that have a value of more than $1 million US. So they neglect smaller mergers and acquisitions, smaller deals. But based on this data, they show, for instance, that 2/3 of all the deals that have been taking place are done by privately held or non-state publicly traded firms. So 2/3 of the total deals would be emanating from private firms. That's in terms of deals. Of course, in terms of values of the deals, it's a bit different because large state-owned companies, of course, account for the large deals. Nonetheless, I think that's interesting maybe to put a little bit into perspective maybe. I think a view that came from the right-hand side of the table that it's all sort of strategic, state-led interests. Again, I'm maybe just contrasting a little bit this view actually. And then I wanted maybe just to respond to Maria and the first question about how to interpret, I think, a little bit this result. And if I understood your intervention properly, is that you're not so surprised that lower educated, lower skilled workers across the EU are very supportive of China globalization, because in a sense they've been so much disappointed and screwed up by either European employers and the European Commission and the lack of policy in protecting them, that they turn to alternatives, right? So is that your interpretation? No? Okay.
What they say is that China and EU behave in the same manner. That's what the question asks. I mean,
they have aligned interest with
they
respect
have
to
aligned
globalization.
interest, right? So
Yes.
basically that they behave in the same way. So they've been looking how EU is behaving. They judge that as being well, bad, right? Easy way, bad. So Chinese is bad as well. So they perceive the strategies as being the same, similar, bad. So they're not supportive of them. You say they're supportive.
Yeah.
I wouldn't agree.
They interpret at least that their interests as European citizens are aligned with the rise of Chinese globalization, and so I think they are overall supportive of the rise of China and what this may mean for their sake. Well, again, I said this question indeed is we would have liked to have an own question put into a survey that is much neater in terms of getting at the perspective on Chinese FDI, and we're working towards that actually. But yeah, that's what was out there in terms of survey question. But I think I will leave it to that. I don't know if someone would like to add something right now.
About the question of state companies, state-owned companies, and state capitalism, I would also water it down this issue a little bit, because there's a lot of private investment, as already shown, and a lot of these state-owned companies are not led directly by Beijing, by central government, but by provincial governments, and those provincial governments in China, as I know, have a lot of other interests compared to the central government, and so on and so on. We can talk. We can have another workshop about this question, definitely. The other question was about the great, the grand scheme, the great strategic theory about the Chinese investment. I think at least in the infrastructure issue, there's a clear topic, and the Chinese government, party boss and state boss Xi Jinping has explained it when he was in, I think in October here in Europe. The concept of the two Silk Roads, one Silk Road, the train corridor, highway corridor from northern China to Berlin, Duisburg, Antwerp, Brussels, and the other is a maritime Silk Road concept, and the investments in Greece and the investment in Serbia perfectly fit into this picture. That's the great conspiracy theory about the whole thing, and they have put aside a sum of about $100 billion for this to implement this concept on the state side. So that's the background of the infrastructure picture.